What are synthetic shares? How are they created? And what role do they play in the GME saga?
Josh, I don't know. This is my best guess. Let's start with the basics. A share is a share is a share. From an accounting/formal definition, I think a synthetic share is a share that appears as an asset on the balance sheet of a non-broker/non-market maker. But there's a very important thing that's associated with it. This share, or what makes it what I call synthetic, and that might not even be the correct term, but just work with me. What makes it synthetic is that there hasn't been a locate or a corresponding sale associated with it. So let me say that in English. Let's see your Webull, Fidelity, whatever, right? You buy a share of GME. It shows up on your balance sheet. That is to say, when you log on to your broker, you say, yep, sure enough, I've got one share. So you, the end user, the business or whatever, right, see it or whatever, right? But in the back end, the plumbing, the actual seller of that share, because remember, you're the buyer and every buyer needs a seller to be mapped up with it. That might not have yet actually been found. Hence why I'm calling the share synthetic. So then you say, well, Justin, this is just gobbledygook. You know, how on earth can you say that this thing exists or whatever, right? The answer then goes back into the concept of, these market makers whose job, and to be fair to the market makers, there is an argument that a role for these entities to exist. So let me tell you the good way of how this would otherwise happen. What's going on is that what you've got in your brokerage account is really an IOU from someone. When you first buy the share, it's actually an IOU, I believe, from your broker. So if you're with Fidelity, it's an IOU share until the share settles. Then behind the scenes, what's going on is Fidelity is given an IOU from, I assume, their clearinghouse. Well, Fidelity is a bad example of self-clearing, but whoever the clearinghouse is or whatever, right? So in your brokerage, you have bought a share and you've paid money for it, but the seller might not yet have been located. This means that if you were to pause time and take a snapshot of all the individuals, who have shares of, let's say, GME in their account, that number would be greater than, let's say, the amount of shares that exist in CD, the Centralized Depository, which is a sub of the DTCC. Now, there is an argument to say, okay, well, something like this actually there might be a functional case for this to exist. But the key thing is that the reason those shares are synthetic, the reason those shares actually exist is because the purchase of that share has already been paired with the seller. For that. So you don't, that's already been cleared out or whatever, right? And so what goes on is that the total aggregate of all the shares that exist on the individual balance sheets of people, you have more shares that actually exist in reality. And it's not necessarily crime or anything like that. Again, you can make an argument, especially if you go back to how old the system was, starting in the 70s and the 80s, they had to update it. It makes sense. Josh, let me just pause for a second. I know this is probably going over many people's heads, but if you remember checks and check kiting, let's say that you have an account at two banks. So this is like way back in the day before mobile banking and all that jazz. Let's say you write yourself a check, okay? And let's say you've got $10,000 in one account and, $1,000 in the other account or whatever, right? You go to the bank and you write yourself a check for $9,000 from the bank that has, the money into the account that doesn't have the money. That check might take 3 business days to clear just because the system back then was really old and cumbersome or whatever, right? But the thing is that the bank you put it into, so the account where you have the $1,000, that bank might credit you the extra $9,000. So all of a sudden, if you were to, let's say, look at that point in time where the check's been deposited into the smaller account, but it hasn't yet cleared the larger account, Josh, from your perspective, you would actually have $20,000. Why? Because you have the $10,000 in the old account, you have the $1,000 plus the $9,000 check you put into the new account, and so $10,000 plus $1,000 plus $9,000 gives you $20,000. In a sense, you've created $9,000 what I call synthetic dollars in this particular situation. Now, it is true, of course, that once that check goes to the various clearing houses of the, I guess would be the Federal Reserve in this particular situation, your $9,000 will be debited from your first account and credited back to your new account. And so therefore the dollars in your new account will be paired up, or that is the dollars in your old account will disappear because you have new dollars in your new account that you wrote your check to or whatever, right? There was an issue, and the form, I guess the slang name is to call it is check kiting. It's much harder, as I understand, it's much harder to do nowadays due to the fact that it's takes so much for instantaneous and settlement. But this is kind of the same concept that goes on through synthetics. And so this is the question that I kind of have to the community, because Jake had asked the question about synthetics, like how does this stuff clear or whatever, right? And so I think what can go on is this. The market maker can basically front saying, okay, listen, we are good for it. And because we're a market maker, we have special privileges, and therefore we have more time to kind of locate this share through our own various operations. Now, we don't have unlimited time, and even though we can kick and can kick again, theoretically, you know, there is a set limit on that. And this is where you see, think like, you know, I think a lot of the FTD volume comes in, you know, from this, which is them having to go to the market and force settle or
well, that's a different way that they're going short, I'd argue, which is mainly through ETFs, where they have to they buy the ETF, short it through there, and then those FTD gets pushed over to GME because they have to rebalance the XRT.
Like, I'm doing my best here or whatever, right? So just bear with us or whatever, right? If you're stumbling through this video. I think what goes on in the ETF is that the ETF acts as a locate. So the ETF says, okay, listen, you know, we will provide the sale of this share to match up with the corresponding buy. So if they do that, but then if the ETF reports on their balance sheet, okay, well, listen, even though we've let numbers out of my backside here, you know, 1 million shares of GME go, looking at you, XRT, but let's just say like we've let, like, you know, a large position of GME go. The reason we can report on our balance sheet that we still are in balance is because we've also signed a futures contract, and this is the check from a prior example with kiting. We've signed a futures contract, or we have some agreement through whatever modus operandi we want to use to take delivery of those 1 million shares. So in other words, you would treat it as something like shares. So this is an accounting term, not necessarily a technical term. You treat it as like you know, like shares due, but like not yet bought. But if the ETF is reporting that on their balance sheet, this is where you actually have, this is the actual synthetic creation part right here, because the ETF is saying, well, listen, we don't have GME shares, but we have something that's, you know, just as good. We have this contract. Yeah.
And before you guys are thinking like that makes absolutely no sense, that's because it makes no sense. And it's like that for an actual reason. And like, so basically, I mean, this exact same thing happened with the actual Fed. Back in the day before QE started, the Fed would still do QE once in a while, but it wasn't called that. They would go into the market and buy bonds. But what you could do, and this is a real life story from someone who actually did it on Morris Sachs' podcast. So what the Fed would do is say, hey, we want $1 billion worth of bonds. And they would list off the bonds that they want. Their firm would say, hey, we'll supply you the bonds. But you didn't actually have to supply them the bonds. You could supply them that same equivalent amount of collateral. And then say you have a deferral period where you could say, okay, within 30 days, say, call it, I have to supply you your treasuries that you wanted, but until then, take my collateral. Everything's great. And that, I think people are starting to understand the formation and what a synthetic share is. So now let's go into how they are actually formed and what would happen on the transactional side when this actually takes place, because it is not like a regular sale of a stock where you go onto your broker online and you buy, say, 1 million shares of GME, or you sell 1 million shares of GME. It's much more a call to a friend and a personal agreement between parties instead of just you're typing it in your computer.
Yep. So Josh, there's two other things that we really need to know on this front. We were asked, that was the question. We were asked to talk about balance sheet expansion. Josh, this is the actual expansion of the balance sheet. To go back to the check kind of example, when you write that check to yourself and you have $9,000 more, but you haven't debited it out of your old account yet, you've expanded your balance sheet. If you have someone who perhaps resides in the Windy City and is a enthusiast of certain sandwich accoutrements and various trimmings you can put on stuff, then in that particular situation, what would be, this is the actual expansion of that firm's, this hypothetical, not naming names, firm's balance sheet.
And to be exact, the expansion is when you put that agreement in, you, instead of taking delivery of that share now, you defer that into the future. The balance sheet expands, and without having to really post the collateral, both balance sheet in that circumstance expand with
the balance sheet expansion. Here's where it boils down to. Let's say you're Citadel or whatever, right? And let's say that you sell $1 million worth of GME shares, but you're going to internalize the order. What you actually do is on your balance sheet, you now have an asset. That's the $1 million that was paid to you. But you also have the liability that's due. That's the IOU GME shares. And the thing is, both expand at the same time because you have $1 million here, plus at that particular point in time, however much, you know, GME is worth or whatever, right? So the balance sheet expands, and at the same time, the person who bought, thinking they were buying real shares, and technically they are, the seller hasn't been located yet because Citadel is putting it onto their balance sheet, thus the expansion of the Citadel balance sheet. In that particular situation, You, the buyer, think that you've got it and you've tendered, the $1 million for it, right? But that is the actual creation of it. Now, of course, the game that's being played here is that they're trying to arbitrage through time, because let's say if they, let's say the person who bought the 1 million shares of GME were buying it at 150. Let's say at a future date, they think the price will be 125. Well, then they can go through and locate the buyers, and they've got this arbitrage thing, because at the same time,
I actually don't think the problem lies with retail buying. I think it much more aligns with big institutions doing these deals on each other's balance sheets synthetically away from the broker. I would say that's where the majority of a short position would be held. It would be it would be a swap.
That's the general mechanics of like maybe how to think about it. And like
Hopefully,
I said,
we are not sure with any of this. Please, we want to hear it from the experts on exactly how this is done, talking T-charts.
The high level perspective. So again, this is the big players in the system. They have the strongest of motivations to not be transparent, or they want to be just enough. They want to have just enough transparency with each other, so they know who's not cheating to an extent, or who they're not going to get boned over by, but not an iota more, because if the public knew, if the regulators knew, assuming they're not already going through revolving door or whatever, right? It's they're just not going to do it. The takeaway point is that Josh, you're absolutely correct. They will spin up so many exotic transactions, or the way I like to use it is exotic transactions to warehouse the short interest, which is just a very fancy schmancy way of saying we want to continue to expand our balance sheet, but we don't want to report it officially, because if we report it officially, people might realize, and this gets back to that great line, we are holding one of the most egregious bags of human excrement that has ever been assembled in the history of capitalism. And God bless Jeremy Irons. Anyways, that's the I think that's the thing, and this is where he gets to this, and this is way beyond my head, but my point is, as you say, there's swaps, there might be other funky ways of doing it, or just an OTC deal.
It's basically the exact same thing. I mean, it would be just like how the banking system works. I'm a massive institution, and Justin's another massive institution. We're friends. We've been working together for decades. I call him up and I say, you know what? I want to place an order to short 5 million shares of GameStop. He's like, yeah, okay. I mean, I'll take you on the other side of that. They do that. If this is the brokerage, they're outside of that. They're not dealing in that realm, because they're just saying, okay, like, great. I mean, that exact same transaction that Justin just walked us through happens on their balance sheet, and they pen and paper it down. Great. Then we move on. That exact same firm who just went 5 million short with them goes to the next firm and says, hey, I'll take 5 million short with you. And then they say, okay, great, I'll take you up on that. But what happens if everybody knows that this one firm just went short 1 million times with 1 million different people? They would say, hold up. If they go bust, I'll have 5 million on my books that is at a loss. And then they'll say, hold up, I know that they're holding potentially at least 5 million on their balance sheet at a loss. What happens if one firm can't pay, and then the next firm can't pay? Hold up, I might not be able to pay if it gets to my firm. And that's what Justin always talks about, where there's all the incentive in the world to not let this happen, because it could blow up everyone around, and we can see counterparty risk building everywhere. But so this is the big issue that I think we have with PiFi saying that MOAS is unlikely. With the current data that we have, I completely agree, because we have like all the data that we have, MOAS is unlikely, because we would need massive option buying. We would need all these ETF rebalances to be much higher. But the big key that we have absolutely zero clue as to what is happening is what is happening with these synthetic shares through swaps and other derivative products that we have absolutely no clue what the real short interest could ever be.
The more you change the rules, the more you add complexity to the system. And when you do complexity, you conjure a demon. And for the time being, you might be able to control that demon. But the larger the demon gets, the more unruly it becomes. And there will be something or some series of events that will happen. And it'll be something stupid. It'll be the Eurodollar crisis of what happened in 08. It'll be LTCM that happened in 98. It'll be the tequila crisis. I mean, like, you can just go down the litany of these things, when the smartest people in the room, the people that had the best lawyers, the best compliance, the smartest quants, etc. It's like the financial Tower of Babel. Anyways.
So here's the functionality as to how these synthetic shares, we think, the key point, we think, are created and how they're being funded in today's realm. We have absolutely no clue to the scale as to what happened, or if we were right in the actual nuancing. So please don't take what we say as face value, but as a guide frame to how we view the GME situation.
It's check kiting. And the reason that it works is because nobody remembers what check kiting is.